Good morning, Vice Chair Spivey Weber and board members. My name is Fred Jacobson. I am Principal Environmental Specialist at San Diego Gas and Electric Company. And I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity to address you on this permit this morning. And I have just several brief comments for you. This is an important permit for our company for the delivery of safe and reliable gas and electric services. And we are appreciative of the time and effort that staff has devoted to the development of the permit, and as part of that process we're also appreciative of the open dialogue that we've had with staff. This has been a very productive regulatory process and we're thankful for that. We believe that the errata that was distributed yesterday and is available today contains some important changes, and with the inclusion of those errata, we're in support of the adoption of the permit today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, Vice Chair and members of the board. My name is Jeremy Lauren. I'm with Pacific Gas and Electric Company, and I'm their Vault Program Manager. And I just wanted to mimic Fred and Hazem's comments and say thank you to the State Board staff and to the board for the work on this permit. We really appreciate the involvement and engagement of the stakeholders over the last 3 years and in the creation of this draft, and we generally support this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That will close the hearing. Do I hear a motion with the errata?
Yes, I would like to move staff recommendation with the change sheet, and in so moving, want to thank staff for convening this collaborative approach that I'm certainly very supportive of, and I think my board members would back me on that assertion. But this is what, you know, folks will say, well, what's the problem? You know, water can change in vaults, you know, if you give it time and that sort of thing. We're going to answer those questions through this collaborative process about, you know, what difference it makes. And, you know, as the governor said yesterday, water's complicated. The more you look, the more you find little things you got to deal with, you know, and that's just the nature of it. And as my professor back, you know, in college used to say, when you look at the Navier-Stokes equation, the most complicated fluid mechanics equation imaginable, he said, simplify, simplify. And that's what we do. We look at these issues, we answer questions, and it helps us focus on what's really important. But we don't let these things that can come back and bite us, you know, we provide the safeguard and we answer the questions. We protect the environment together. Thanks for the partnership. I move staff recommendation with change sheet.
Second the motion.
All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? It is passed. Thank you. Now we'll move on quickly to the board workshop. This is our second public workshop on the draft resolution approving a mitigated neg deck and exceptions to the statewide implementation policy and the California Ocean Plan for drinking water system discharges, and the draft statewide general National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit for drinking water system discharges. We have staff presentation on changes only, correct?
Yes.
And then we have two speaker groups, or the City of Pasadena Water and Power and the California Water Association, who will each have 10 minutes each following staff presentation and any questions that the board members have. And then we'll move to public comments.
Very good. Thank you. Do we have a presentation? Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, Madam Vice Chair Spivey Weber and board members. I'm Diana Messina. I'm the chief of the Surface Water Permitting section in our Division of Water Quality here at the State Board. Next to me, I have Renan Haragi. He's our primary permit writer for this permit. And on my left is Marley Wood, and she's our Office of Chief Counsel Attorney on this item. So we are trying to simplify here. Board Member Moore. And so this is the first board workshop. We held a board hearing on August 5th. I just want to make that clear. This workshop is on the per the request of many commenters, and it is on the final draft statewide permit package for drinking water system discharges to surface water. Okay, I'm going to be going through this process that we have been through so far. Back in last year or so, couple years, we've been developing draft documents with the stakeholders. We developed our draft resolution and draft permit, and we held the public hearing on August 5th. Public comments were due on August 19th, and that was a little over 45 days of public comment period. We issued our draft resolution and permit on October 2nd. That is what I will be briefly going over, those changes on the October 2nd draft. We are still working on response to comments, so we do not have those issued. Today is our workshop, and we have consideration of adoption publicly noticed for the November 4th meeting. Okay, but just to go over real quickly to make sure all the comments are in context. We have 3 different items in this package. The first is the draft resolution granting the regulatory exceptions. And so, again, this applies to mandated activities due to the Safe Drinking Water Act and Health and Safety Code. This accepts water purveyors from our California Toxic Rule and our ocean plan, and it is for constituents with criteria and objectives which are more stringent than the maximum contaminant levels set by our now our Division of Drinking Water, and they are to enforce them. This does not accept water purveyors from TMDLs or other federal or state regulations. And so I'm touching on this simply because of the comments you may hear. The second item is attached to the proposed resolution. It's the final draft mitigated negative declaration. This is the CEQA document for the exception that you are considering providing to water purveyors. The exception is to our state implementation plan, which implements our California Toxic Rule. And I seem to have a delay on my clicker here. There you go. And to the California Ocean Plan. The most important conclusion on this document is that you, as the State Water Board, are granting the proposed exception, and the discharges that receive this exception will cause a less than significant impact to the environment when properly mitigated. And that is the foundation of our statewide permit, as well as any other permits that this exception is implemented through. So the third item, which is the item that's been getting most of the attention, is our draft NPDES permit. This is a statewide permit with the intention that this will be the sole permit for these low threat type discharges. It does regulate the same type discharges which our resolution and our mitigated negative declaration is based on. And so that's the mandatory drinking water system discharges. It implements the exception, as I mentioned. I'm sorry. The permit itself is truly, with the exception of one chlorine limit for the most part, it's focused on best management practices. That is the mitigation that is described in the mitigated negative declaration. I'll be going over just a brief overview of the public comments we received, the changes we made to the draft documents to address the comments, the requested changes that are not made in the final draft document, and the comments that we could not address by the proposed resolution or the statewide permit, comments that must be addressed elsewhere. Okay, so just a couple reminders here, which is addressing some of the overarching comments. Why is the state board going forward with this permit? The very basis is it's to provide water purveyors with a permit that will give them regulatory coverage and throughout all the regions within California. It's to implement a consistent regulation statewide. Right now, through our 9 regions, we have approximately 7 to 9 different permits. If and when this permit is adopted, it will take the place of 382 regulated permittees. And for the most part, there will only need to be approximately 10 of those regional board permits that permittees will have to keep coverage for other non-drinking water discharges. In Region 4, there may be about 48 groundwater operations, which Region 4 may have to maintain a separate permit on. Those are groundwater operations that require additional treatment due to the quality of the groundwater not meeting drinking water standards. Okay. So my clicker here has a little lag time. So I'm going to just keep clicking. Is there a problem? Is there another way I can do this? All right. Do we have a keyboard I can work off of that is more immediate? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Okay, very good. So, so the second overarching comment is, why can't the board leave the existing regulatory structure in place? The existing regulatory structure we have does not provide consistency, either through permitting or through the exception in which we are granting. And it also doesn't make efficient use of our staff resources. The biggest change in this draft permit is additional change in which we have even lowered the monitoring and reporting requirements even further.
Diana, could you please go back to the last slide? Before you move off the slide, please provide a little bit more clarity on what you mean by regulatory coverage. I think that's may not be well understood by all the regulated entities involved in this issue.
Okay, very good. So regulatory coverage, when we're speaking to discharges to waters of the United States, means coverage through an NPDES permit to fulfill the obligations under the Clean Water Act. Through the Clean Water Act, any discharge of a pollutant into a water of the United States requires an NPDES permit unless otherwise exempt through federal regulation, which Marley can speak through further. Yes, we have understood through the entire stakeholder process that this is an education component that is necessary to take place, especially with the smaller communities. As I go further and we talk about the minimum threshold that the State Water Board is requiring for systems to come under this permit, that threshold does not excuse a water system from their obligations they have under the Clean Water Act. So this permit is available for all water systems that have these mandatory discharges to obtain regulatory coverage to meet their obligation under the Clean Water Act.
So without this permit, those agencies, those systems would not have regulatory coverage, but they must still comply with the Clean Water Act. And so without this permit, what are their vulnerabilities?
Do you want to speak to it?
There is a provision in the Clean Water Act that allows for citizen suits where if someone is discharging without a permit, they can be vulnerable to that. There's also enforcement, but we're not looking at enforcing on anybody at this point. So Any discharge that doesn't have appropriate permit coverage does have some vulnerabilities and some things to think about if they want to go ahead with discharges that are not adequately covered under the NPDES permit program.
And that program is through the Federal Clean Water Act. It's a
Correct.
mandate through the Federal
Correct.
Clean Water Act.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm clicking away here. All right, so as we go through, and Courtney, if you can help a little bit, thanks. So there have been some major changes. Because of the major changes, we did not post a red line strikeout draft, and there's a lot of folks that have commented about that. We did post a list of the changes. There have been so many changes because we went further to have the final documents attempt to clarify the permit. I'm sorry, Courtney, thanks. The final draft permit raises the threshold of the size of systems required to enroll. I will touch on these things a little bit more further. It also modifies the requirements to submit a notice to the water board if the permit is not applicable. It modifies the turbidity effluent limitation and the monitoring. It strengthens the emphasis on beneficial use of putting these discharges to groundwater recharge or to a reuse, using the water for irrigation purposes or other purposes. And we're modifying the monitoring and notification requirements, even to reduce down the cost even more. That also includes modification of the reporting requirements and modification of the requirements to identify which receiving waters these discharges are going to. So to clarify the permit, we've added some key definitions to the front page right off the bat. What's a water purveyor? What's a discharge? What's a drinking water system? We made sure we addressed the comment from the comments from our water wholesalers, right, that transmission system facilities are eligible for coverage or the discharges from them. We made changes to the permit to facilitate the document. Within the first few pages, a reader can understand if they need to read further and become enrolled in this document. Otherwise, they can just put that document down. Otherwise, if they do fall within the categories that they need to take coverage, they can read on and they can read the requirements and so forth. So Courtney, I think my battery's
sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Messina. This is part of the reason why it was hard to do a red line strikeout, isn't that right? Because you were reordering the permit.
Yes, I actually took an independent permit writer out of Region 5 to have her read that permit and restructure it, and so it helped having some outside eyes on it.
Right, okay, thanks.
So we simplified the permit. We deleted all the details about meeting maximum contaminant levels. That wasn't necessary because we just put in that the receiving water limits are based on the regional board basin plans, and for those water bodies that have municipal use or any kind of drinking water use or contact recreation and so forth, the MCLs are already pulled into those objectives. So there was no need to go into that detail. All right, so with the clarification of the permit, we made sure it was clear that all discharges need to have best management practices implemented. There seems to be some different viewpoints on this. When I think of managing your discharges, I think of looking at where it flows and what needs to be done to make sure the receiving water bodies are protected. This does not mean that all discharges need to have expensive treatment or control items placed to them. So these are the routine management practices you see a lot of the districts doing over there. And again, the focus is on toxicity due to chlorine, solids, trash, erosion, scour, and hydro modification. Okay, so we also clarified, we have a list of BMPs in attachment C. Those are for examples for those folks that are just starting. But we have written the permit that we are depending on AWWA and other industries out there that put out the state-of-the-art BMPs to provide those BMP guidelines. So when it comes to TMDLs, it appeared that it scared a lot of people that we had pages of summaries of existing TMDLs out of Region 4 and Region 9, that as we worked with the regional boards, we saw that those TMDLs do pull in water purveyors. We clarified that through this permit, you as a state board, you're not amending those basin plans, that you are simply implementing what has already been adopted. We added a table to the fact sheet. It's a fairly long table, but it basically just lists the water bodies and what pollutants a water purveyor would have to monitor for in addition to the standard application. This is how we are addressing the TMDLs. So there was an example right there of the table. So you look up the water body you're discharging to, and then to the right, that's the list of constituents you need to monitor for and include that lab analysis in the application. All right, so when it comes to systems required to enroll, we raised the threshold from 15 or more to 1,000 or more. We made sure we added language that states exactly what we were discussing, that systems less than 1,000, they continue to be obligated to comply with the Clean Water Act if their discharges reach waters of the U.S., and this permit is available for them to enroll if desired. We received lots of comments, like you heard during the August 5th hearing, about folks not wanting to have to submit a notice of non-applicability if they do not fall under the requirements to enroll in this permit. We did not remove that requirement. We still stand that we need these notices to make sure we can do a full compliance evaluation through our databases. We did further simplify that one-page form, though, and we added a signature page. And we're proposing that these notices are due to the state board 3 months after adoption. Right now, the draft permit says February 1st. If this is adopted on November 4th, we add 3 months and we round up to the next beginning of the month. So, so that February 1st date will have to be changed due to the postponement of adoption. So turbidity. Turbidity is the indicator that we are using when it comes to being able to manage the solids that come out of, in particular, the groundwater well development and rehabilitation operations. So we had a turbidity effluent limitation of 10 turbidity units in the first draft. Due to a lot of comments on just the feasibility and the expense, we had our analysts call several districts and they gave us lots of information. And so we decided to replace that turbidity effluent limitation with a threshold. Instead of 10, it's 100 turbidity limits. And the reason it's a threshold is we're concerned about mandatory minimum penalties. This isn't what we're after when it comes to providing this permit. So we, so this BMP specification applies to only waters of inland waters because the ocean plan has its own turbidity effluent limitation. It applies solely to groundwater supply well operations, and so that has been clarified in the permit. And you can see when you have these operations that the purpose of the operation is to flush out all that gunk and sands that is in the well casing. And so it's important to keep the solids in check. we added language requiring the discharger to enhance the BMPs until the turbidity is below 100. And there's still room for maybe a little bit more language in there to make sure it's clear that they're not in violation of the permit if they're over 100, and then they take the following actions to reduce it down to below 100.
Yeah, on that point, that kind of harkens back to the last item in a way, right? With the idea of a numeric action level, that's not, if you cross that level, if you have a result that's higher than that level, it's not a permit violation, but there are actions that are anticipated or expected.
Correct. And so for that utility vault permit and this permit, these permits are looking more and more like stormwater permits when it comes to those type of thresholds and numeric action levels, right? The last item here, which is of importance, is comments we got due to cost of field meters. So there were lots of comments that came in regarding the cost of turbidity field meters, and the turbidity field meters can cost between $400 to $1,000 from our research. And so to address that, we replaced the turbidity monitoring, instead of it being metered, with visual estimates. So what we have here, the draft that went out in July was turbidity metering of all the discharges, and this draft has visual estimates. So now we put out to the public notice basically 2 bookends. There is the concern that turbidity meters isn't, or excuse me, your visual naked eye cannot detect what's 100 NTU. So space we have to address this is if we keep the visual turbidity monitoring in effect for monitoring that's conducted once a year for just those treated discharges or very clear discharges through to flushing to make sure they're not pushing solids into the storm drain or the receiving waters, and still apply turbidity meter monitoring to the well operations when they do rehab or development. So you do have that choice. You may hear from one of the commenters about their concern about the removing the turbidity metering in this latest draft. So as we know, with the drought continuing on, there is we put more of an emphasis on beneficial use and reuse. After talking to you folks individually as board members and other commenters, especially coastkeepers, they were really concerned about the use or putting this water to use. So we added in the application requirements on whether it's feasible to use a portion of the discharge for irrigation or for other uses. We know there's people out there needing water, and we know that if there is a planned release, that some folks may just want to bring their truck, use it for dust control, or else take extra look at their LID features for new development, especially on how it can accommodate these hydrant flushings, etc. Land disposal of the portion of a discharge may also be viable, and that's, we're looking at groundwater infiltration. The final draft permit adds monitoring and annual reporting requirements for estimated volume of water discharged to surface water, as well as estimated volume that's put to a beneficial reuse. We put this in just to get people to start thinking, those that are not doing this, to maybe plan and see what they can do.
And this is, are they able to provide this information electronically?
This is in the application package, which right now we have all hard copy because we don't have SWRCB up to speed to submit it all electronically. The annual reporting, they will be able to submit it to us and we'll have it up on SWRCB. Regardless, all this information will be put into the public database. Okay, so the changes we made to the monitoring and notification requirements has to do with events monitoring. Events monitoring is basically the events that are going to require monitoring after every discharge. And we limited that to superchlorinated discharges, to well development and rehabilitation discharges, and to individual discharges that are greater than 1 acre-foot. We went on and we added a requirement for effluent chlorine concentrations for all the superchlorinated discharges. Those discharges are discharges of water in which the chlorine is purposely elevated to clean and sanitize facilities. And so we feel that there's a specific toxicity threat there that warrants monitoring. This draft also limits the type of events which are requiring pH monitoring, and that's solely for superchlorinated discharges. The other type of monitoring is representative monitoring, which one sample represents other like-type discharges. We expanded that representative monitoring to include discharges that are going directly into surface waters. So now a water purveyor can use one sample of a direct discharge to represent other similar type direct discharges. So that's another area where we have attempted to reduce cost.
Real quickly, to give us a sense of context, how common are superchlorinated discharges? Just generically, 1 in 10. I mean, how often do they come up? I know it's going to vary.
So throughout the state, I cannot say how often, but I can answer your question on what it's for. So you have to superchlorinate every time you either clean a pipeline, you repair a pipeline and where it could be contaminated. You have to clean or repair any water treatment facilities, any facilities that are either brand new or become contaminated due to repair work.
Okay. Yeah. So
the number, I'm sorry, I can't.
Don't worry about that. But
okay.
yeah, I just want to get a sense of, relative to the other type of discharges. But it sounds like it's fairly common.
It's common, and those will be larger discharges. Those won't be the couple 100 gallons for the most part. Okay, so the further changes we made was we removed the provision that allows a regional water board executive officer the discretion to require additional monitoring. And this discretion now solely remains with the Deputy Director of Water Quality. There was the concern that we'd get away from consistency if regional board executive officers had the discretion to add more monitoring in a notice of applicability, which is the approval for enrollment. The draft permit also modifies the requirements for the dischargers to pre-notify the regional water boards of a discharge that's greater than 1 acre-foot. And this is for them to also pre-notify the applicable MS4 storm drain operator. The draft permit also replaces the requirement for post-notification of emergency discharges. We removed that requirement that they notify the California Office of Emergency Services, and we replaced it with post-notification to the regional board and the applicable MS4 operator. We just contend that these are local entities. They know what to do under emergency. They don't need an NPDES permit to tell them whom to notify. But we do want to make sure that the MS4 stormwater permittees are alerted if they're going to get an emergency discharge routed to their system. So for reporting, the draft permit modifies the annual reporting requirements to include record keeping. This is new. Instead of having the discharger submit all the reports to us, we decided to propose to have them maintain their own self-monitoring reports at their own main office. And they make these reports available to our board or a regional board per request. This again is to reduce the burden on reporting. So we're having them only submit their non-compliance monitoring information, as well as their discharge volume information to us annually. An issue when it came to cost was a concern that many of the water purveyors had when it comes to identifying the receiving water bodies. We received many comments, and I've heard these comments throughout all the stakeholder communications. They requested that we remove that requirement from the application, but we did not do that. We feel it's necessary for a discharger to understand what the water quality objectives are that they must manage their discharges to comply with. They need to know where their water's going. But we did simplify the requirement to the receiving waters. We stated that in the application, they must identify which regional board jurisdiction that their discharges are located, as well as the name of the water bodies or the major downstream water bodies. That helps in them not having to identify unnamed tributaries or the very small tributaries. That takes a little more research. So for the adoption process, as you know, we have many people who have been requesting additional 30-day public comment period. Today's meeting was supposed to be the adoption meeting until we changed this to an additional workshop for you to listen to more communication from our interested parties. So the adoption meeting is for November 4th, and if and when adopted on November 4th, there will be a proposed due date for the applications and notices of non-applicability to come in. We have right now 3 months. I noticed with some communications I've had as recent as this week, there's folks confusing the effective date of the permit with the date that an application or a notice is due. The effective date of the permit, we're proposing 100 days, and that is in accordance with the MOU we have with US EPA. I'd like to not delay the effective permit date because we do have water districts out there that want this permit as soon as possible. If folks feel they need more time and you feel it's appropriate to grant more time than 3 months to put an application package together, we can postpone the due date for an application package or notice while we still have the permit going into effect, allowing people to get a permit sooner if they just submit sooner. So, so with that, we did not remove the chlorine effluent limit as we continued getting requests for that. That we just do not believe can be made to comply with our reasonable potential analysis. For threats to surface water. And that, again, is for protection of aquatic life. We did further, we did provide an increase to the turbidity threshold from 10 to 100, but we did not remove the limit altogether because there is a reasonable potential for those well operations to impact our surface waters or exceed basin plan objectives. And we did not remove TMDL implementation language. We did receive lots of comments asking the board to just remove TMDLs and not address them in the manner that we're addressing them. So with that, this is the last slide, I promise you. Comments that cannot be addressed through this permit. We are not addressing the determination of water transfers being exempt from federal requirements. And Marley can speak more to that as necessary. We are not able to address the request we got from many MS4 permittees to put language into this permit which will protect them from liability of conveying these drinking water discharges to surface waters. So Marley can address that a little further also. And lastly, we are not able to implement the regulatory exception to MS4 systems through this permit. When that resolution is adopted, that exception is available if a regional board or a state board wants to implement it through either a stormwater MS4 NPDES permit or a non-stormwater NPDES permit. However, that cannot be done through this statewide permit. The dischargers here are solely water purveyors. They are not MS4 permittees. And so with that, that is the end of all the changes. Those were only the major changes, and so if other comments come for the minor changes, I'll just answer to those.
Any questions?
Just for a context question, so you mentioned you changed the threshold for required enrollees from the 15 or more connections up to the 1,000 or more connections. Roughly how many entities are we anticipating would be required to enroll?
There's about 3,000 altogether community water systems, and out of those, 2,400 are small community systems, less than 1,000 connections. So we're talking about 2,400 roughly, and then 600 will be covered under the current permit as regulated or required to be regulated.
As proposed. Okay, thanks for none. Thank you.
Okay, so that you can prepare for, I'm assuming we want to go straight through till 1 o'clock. I think we can finish by 1. I will, the first actually 3 speakers representing 2 organizations have been given additional time. I note that Jack Hawks and Brandy Hancock from the California Water Association have asked for 12 minutes, and David Kimbrough from the city of Pasadena has asked for 10. Everyone else will have 3 minutes. Most people suggested less than that, but 3 minutes, and I think we will finish around 1 o'clock. Okay, let's Brandy Hancock and Jack Hawks, I'm not sure in what order, followed by David Kimbrough, followed by Gary Soketh.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair and board members. The staff, my name is Jack Hawks, Executive Director of the California Water Association. My group represents the regulated public water systems under the jurisdiction of the California Public Utilities Commission. I am going to do the setup here. Brandy Hancock from Golden State Water is actually going to provide the substantive comments. But I want to first thank the staff and Diana for being responsive, as you've just seen, for all the changes that have been made thus far. There's been a lot of progress on this permit since the initial draft we saw in June. And I think this effort is actually very good for all of us, because we on the drinking water side, the purveyor side, are coming from the Safe Drinking Water Act and the world of Title 22 and the water work standards, and we live under very precise requirement. We have lived under very precise requirements in our permits and compliance orders and processes and requirements. And as you've just seen, this permit in the clean water world, under which the State Water Board has lived for all these years, is a different world. And this effort, I think, collaboration is going to help us all as we move forward with the Water Board's supervision of the state's drinking water program. So I kind of like that part. That's worked out. However, and I'll get to where we are, we still have a number of issues involved with this permit. In particular, we've got about 26 remaining policy issues or clarification issues that we would like the staff to continue to evaluate or reevaluate their existing positions. Some of the language some of the limiting language actually is of particular concern to us because it mitigates against our liability risk, and that is going to be a significant issue. Right now, all these systems are making their discharges under the Clean Water Act, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, under and these are all authorized. Well, this permit's going to disrupt that and increase our liability risk. And part of the reason of that is some of the language is overly broad and some of the language is limiting. Diana, we met with Diana last week, and she very patiently and painstakingly explained to us why the language was written as it was, and we understand and appreciate the staff's position, but nonetheless, we have a number of areas that we would like the staff to reconsider. And I actually have, and I'd like to just submit this into the record, Board Member Moore, we actually did go to the trouble of doing a red line for the entire permit, and I'd like to submit this into the record. Brandy is going to come up now and just speak to just a few of the more substantive items. You're up.
Thank you again.
Make sure you're very close to it.
Thank you again for allowing us to speak today, Madam Vice Chair and members of the board. I have the opportunity to represent California Water Association today, but I also am a board member of the California-Nevada American Water Works Association. I work with Golden State Water Company. We have about 1 million customers spread over about 10 counties. So we're representative at a lot of different areas in the state. I do appreciate the efforts of staff. I think the reorganization of the permit has helped immensely. It's more clear, and then we've made some tremendous progress. But as Jack pointed out, we do have a few extra areas of clarification that we would like, and to kind of add on to some of the things that Diana went over in her presentation. The first thing we would like to request is, in fact, an extension of the time to submit some of these applications after the time of the permit's actual effective date. And we'd like a time of at least 180 days after the effective date. The reason for this is that this particular permit is going to require some effort on the part of a lot of our member agencies to put together the notice of intent application. That includes identifying not just the receiving water bodies and where the water goes, but that delineation of whether it is in fact a water of the U.S. Most of our member agencies are very cognizant of where the water goes, but that very technical and legal aspect of defining whether in fact that dry drainage in an arid portion of California is a water of the U.S. is a substantial technological and economic threshold to overcome. And so we need some extra time to be able to do that, to bring the appropriate consultants on board to be able to submit a complete notice of intent for this permit. We also need some time to develop and revise operating procedures for the implementation of BMPs in the field, for measuring techniques, also to roll out training on the required notification. There is a lot of variety in how the current permits are done, and so this will make some things simpler in standardization across the area, but it will mean a change for a lot of different utilities. We want to make a couple comments about some clarifying points within the permit. We want to make sure that we've spoke with staff, and it's our understanding that the intent of the permit is not to apply receiving body limitations directly to the discharges at the point of discharge, but rather to prohibit drinking water discharges that cause or contribute to receiving water exceedances and water quality standards. So we think there just needs to be some clarification in the language to make sure that that's clear. Also, in regards to the turbidity measurements, this part of this discussion already occurred, but it's not clear in the permit right now entirely in all sections of it whether in fact that is an effluent limit or it's a numeric action level, making some clarity there so we understand what conditions we are subject to. In addition, we do appreciate staff's understanding that in many circumstances the cost of a turbidity meter is excessive for all types of discharges and limiting when we need that, but some of that language hasn't been implemented clearly. There's still some footnotes in some of the tables that sort of reference when handhelds are required and when not. So that's just, these are kind of clarifying points that we want to make sure are absolutely clear for our member agencies to understand what's covered and what's not covered. And this is getting back to the idea of the delineation. We want to be able to allow some assumptions for waters of the U.S. when people are looking at other types of technical resources available. There aren't any maps or data sources available that show waters of the U.S. There are some other maps that will show receiving water bodies, but those may not in fact be waters of the U.S. We just want to make sure it's clear that if in our notice of intent application we make some assumptions that something is a water of the U.S., that doesn't actually create additional liability, and that's not a binding type of decision. We're going to make some assumptions on a conservative level that something is a water of the U.S. when perhaps it's not. Like that significant nexus isn't exactly there, or we didn't actually send a biologist out to determine if there was a high watermark, and that there's some flexibility there that we might be overly conservative, but that doesn't actually, we don't incur additional liability for that. In addition, while the permit makes it clear that the notice of intent fees are issued on the basis of total number of connections for a particular system, if one water purveyor has to submit multiple NOIs for multiple small systems, we want to make sure that when we looked at the adopted fee schedule, it was clear that there was an ability to do it on total systems, but we want that to be made clear within the permit, so that in addition to the NOI application fee, that the annual fees can be based on total number of connections and not simply all the systems. And the reason for that is there's a couple utilities that have multiple systems. We want to make sure there's equity between a large system that has, say, 250,000 connections and another operator who has lots of different systems, but they happen to be less than 250 connections. Just want to make sure there's some equity there. We also want to point out, and we know that currently, there's a lot of concern about reuse and with drought conditions, but we want to stress that the water suppliers are not wasting water. Staff's been very good to implement some information into this and an understanding of the Division of Drinking Water requirements that we operate under, that these are mandated discharges. But we're concerned about some of the language that it's indicating and requiring water utilities to actually designate which waters are beneficial and which are not beneficial. It's difficult under the current water code. It's not clear that actually recharge is a beneficial reuse. In addition, the augmentation of current stream flows may in fact be a beneficial use. There's some subjectiveness there, and this puts us in a position of trying to make those determinations every year. We are already highly incentivized to reuse this water as much as possible. This is our primary product. There is a huge financial incentive to make sure that we use the water as responsibly as possible. In addition, within the permit language, they have given us additional motivations in reducing the monitoring, which we do appreciate, but we're concerned about that requirement to notify those particular points. We want to also clarify within attachment C, there's a requirement to dechlorinate all chlorinated discharges, and we want to make sure that there's some clarity there, that it's not all discharges, but only discharges that would actually potentially reach a receiving water body. There are many very, very small discharges, several ounces, that might be, for example, on an online analyzer, and the cost to implement dechlorination for that discharge that's not actually going to get anywhere would be substantial. So we want our industry is very good about implementing BMPs, and we do have it in all the areas, but want to make sure some of that language that uses words like all are used intentionally and with caution in those particular circumstances. That concludes the majority of the comments we have on this permit, because I realize I'm running out of time, and so I appreciate it, and we're available for any questions you might have.
And we did allow you actually extra time that you didn't ask for, so that's good. Why don't you give that to Janine?
Good. I've got a couple of questions for
Sure.
staff based on those comments, and I thank you for the detailed comments. Those are clear. And this gets back to what our intent is, and Ms. Messina kind of alluded to that in terms of the reasons we're doing this activity, and then there's questions that come up, such as the legal definition of waters of the U.S., right? And what was the intent here, and what would be beneficial use, and so I think there's a lot of latitude that we have here, in terms of there's the receiving waters we identify, but you can connect the dots within our fact sheet and our permit, which the intent of these discharge protections is to protect aquatic life, right? Whether through smothering by sediments or through chlorination, exposure to chlorination. So, I think, right off the bat, you think, oh, well, is it a water of the U.S. or it isn't? It is an NPDES requirement there. That might be over dicing, or dwelling on a legal issue that may not really be all that relevant. Ultimately, it's based on the exposure risk that we want to emphasize. So I'd like you to comment on, you know, just how granular we need to get on identifying waters of the U.S. versus just being aware of where the receiving water are and if there's water in those receiving waters or not, and what relevant management practices are expected. Okay, that's number one, it's a water U.S. issue. Number two, I think the fees issue for multiple small systems, I'd just like you to answer the question about that and the level of effort staff has, because we like our fees to match how much effort staff has to make. So I'd like to comment on the fees question. And then third, and it relates to the first point, you know, the attachment C question, you know, if something isn't going to reach, something is not going to reach receiving waters, is there a different level of expectation for sort of the pre-treatment or the BMP that's expected? So those are three things. And then I point out, you know, and so you've got those, right? And I point out that, you know, site-specific circumstances matter tremendously. We always point this out. We always will acknowledge this. A dry creek that could be waters of the U.S. because of the 3-parameter wetland delineation. I've been trained in the technique myself. You know, just because it's dry doesn't mean it's not a water of the U.S., but there's an opportunity there at the right time of year to have groundwater recharge benefits, and that can be pointed out, I hope, through this permit, and it would be one of those examples that a water purveyor would have the freedom to be able to point out as something that's having a beneficial water supply effect, you know, in terms of a dry creek that percolates down to a groundwater basin that's used for water supply. So, you know, just point out, I think I can see the flexibility within the permit to allow for these things. Clarification is always good. But on those points, I'd love to hear your response. Thanks.
Okay, very good. I want to make sure I heard your first question, especially because I was a little
yeah, the
distracted.
waters of the U.S.
Yes.
Vicki, did you want to jump in ahead?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to one of the comments, and it was the comment about beneficial uses of groundwater being confusing. I think that's because the folks who are being regulated under this permit are used to our water right authorities and not our water quality authorities. It is true that there is some dispute in the water rights world over identifying recharge of groundwater as a beneficial use. For the purposes of filing a water right application, there's a water code section, I think it's 1241, that says that you know, the ultimate use is the beneficial use. And the distinctions between how beneficial uses are treated for the purposes of a water right application and how they're treated in the water quality world have become apparent to me in a couple of venues. One of them's D-Cell, the other one's this one. But again, that water code section applies to designation of groundwater recharge for the purposes of filing a water right application. This is not for the purpose of filing a water right application. And in fact, I would suspect that if the water purveyors could quantify how much water they're putting into the ground for groundwater recharge, they might be able to claim that water under their water right licenses or under their water right permits when they go to license. Because it's obviously being put to beneficial use. So I just wanted to clarify, those are two different things. And, you know, they're not necessarily the same. Thanks.
And this permit as drafted allows, as I point out, the water purveyors to take credit